Alara knew she was different from the moment she could comprehend the whispers that followed her. In a world where uniformity was not just encouraged but engineered, her body stood as a rebellion she never chose. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with a bone structure that defied the delicate framework considered ideal, she cast shadows where others barely dimmed the light. Her shoulders were broad, her hands capable of work that would strain most others, and her stride covered ground that took others 2 steps. Mars Colony 7 prided itself on efficiency. After 3 generations of carefully controlled reproduction and genetic optimization, the colony had achieved what its founders called peak biological harmony. Every citizen was designed to fulfill specific roles while maintaining reproductive compatibility, the ultimate measure of value in a society where population control meant survival. The Reproductive Compatibility Index was more than a medical assessment. It was the social currency that determined your place. Alara's designation came on her 16th birthday, as it did for all colonists. She still remembered the sterile white room, the expressionless face of Dr. Mercer as he studied the holographic display of her scan results. Incompatible, he had said, his voice flat as the stark walls around them. Skeletal muscular anomaly pattern indicates 0 reproductive viability. With that single word, her identity was sealed. Not citizen, not contributor, but barren. A designation that might as well have been branded into her skin for how visibly it marked her. The memory faded as Alara squeezed herself into the transport pod, headed to the lower levels. The seats, like everything else in the colony, were designed for the optimized human form, a form she had never and would never possess. A man in a pristine gray uniform glanced at her, then quickly away, his expression a familiar mixture of discomfort and disdain. She had long ago mastered the art of making herself smaller, hunching her shoulders and drawing in her limbs, a physical apology for the space she occupied. The pod descended through the gleaming upper levels where the most genetically compatible citizens lived and worked, down past the middle tiers where specialists and technical workers resided, finally stopping at level 7. Unofficial home to the colony's inefficiencies. Here, the corridors were narrower, the lighting dimmer, as if the colony itself was trying to hide its mistakes. Alara stepped out, straightening to her full height now that she was among her own kind. The colony's service workers, maintenance crew, and others deemed genetically inadequate for reproduction. They were the ones who kept the systems running, cleaned the waste processors, and handled the physical labor that the optimized bodies above were too precious to perform. Her workstation was in the primary water filtration plant, a sprawling maze of pipes and purification tanks that processed the recycled water for the entire colony. The job required strength and endurance, qualities her flawed body possessed in abundance. The irony wasn't lost on Alara. Her physical differences made her unsuitable for reproduction, yet perfect for the hard labor that kept the colony functioning. System check on Tank 12 is showing pressure variations. Her supervisor, a thin man with a perpetual nervous twitch, announced as she arrived. Need you to go in and verify the internal sensors. Alara nodded. Tank maintenance was her specialty. The narrow access tunnels were challenging for most, but her reach and strength made her particularly effective. It was dangerous work, but that was another unspoken reality of Level 7. Those considered of lesser value were given the higher-risk assignments. As she gathered her tools and prepared for the confined space entry, she caught her reflection in the polished metal surface of a control panel. Her face, with its strong jaw and pronounced brow, stared back at her. Not ugly, not by any objective standard, but different. Wrong. The face of someone who would never carry a child, never pass on her genes, never fully belong. The thought stung, as it always did. There had been a time when she'd fought against the designation, insisted that the scans must be wrong. But years of watching others paired off in carefully arranged reproductive matches, seeing the status and privileges that came with pregnancy and parenting, had worn down her resistance. She had accepted her place, finding what dignity she could in the work she was allowed to do. 2 hours later, covered in filtration residue and with aching muscles from the physical exertion of the inspection. Elara made her way to the community dining hall. Like everything on level 7, it was utilitarian and sparse compared to the upper levels. The food was nutritionally adequate, but designed for sustenance rather than pleasure, another subtle reminder of status. She took her tray to an empty corner table, automatically choosing a spot where her size would be least noticeable. The daily ritual of public meals was perhaps the most difficult part of her day, a time when she felt most exposed to the judgmental glances and whispers. "Mind if I join you?" The voice caught her off guard. Elara looked up to see a man standing beside her table, tray in hand. He was of average height, which meant he stood nearly a foot shorter than her, with an unremarkable build that suggested he was from one of the middle tiers. His hair was dark, cut in the practical style favored by technical workers, and his eyes were a deep blue that seemed to hold more curiosity than judgment. "There are other tables," she said, the words coming out more harshly than intended, a defensive reflex honed by years of rejection. "There are," he agreed with a slight smile, "but none with someone who just finished servicing Tank 12. I'm Kale, by the way. New transfer to environmental systems." Elara hesitated, searching for the hidden motive in his request. New arrivals to the colony were rare, transfers between stations even more so. Either way, his presence at her table would only subject him to the same social scrutiny she endured. "Suit yourself," she finally said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Kale sat down, seemingly unbothered by the curious glances from nearby tables. "I'm supposed to be evaluating the filtration system efficiency, but these reports make no sense without someone who knows the practical operation." Elara studied him as he spoke, waiting for his eyes to do the usual dance. The quick assessment of her size, the subtle recoil, the careful maintenance of eye contact to pretend the evaluation hadn't happened. But his gaze remained steady, focused on her face rather than her frame. "The reports never match reality," she found herself saying. "The system works because we make adjustments that aren't in the protocols." Kale nodded, a genuine interest in his expression. "That's exactly what I suspected. The efficiency numbers were too perfect." He leaned forward slightly. "Would you be willing to show me? The actual process, I mean. Tomorrow, maybe?" The request was professional, logical even, but Elara felt a strange unease. Not the familiar discomfort of being singled out for her differences, but something else. An unexpected flutter of awareness that this man, this stranger, was looking at her with none of the predisposed judgments she had come to expect. "I start at 0600, she said, the words escaping before she could analyze why she was agreeing. "Perfect," Kale smiled, the expression reaching his eyes. "Thank you, I didn't catch your name." "Elara." "Thank you, Elara. I think you're going to save me weeks of wasted analysis." As he focused on his meal, Elara found herself stealing glances at him. There was nothing remarkable about Kale. He wasn't particularly handsome by colony standards, nor did he have the physical markers of genetic optimization that the upper tiers valued. Yet there was something about the way he carried himself, a confidence that didn't seem rooted in status or designation. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Elara felt seen rather than observed, a subtle but profound difference that left her both unsettled and strangely hopeful. The following morning, Elara arrived at her workstation earlier than usual, an inexplicable nervousness making her movements less fluid than normal. She told herself it was merely professional concern. Showing a newcomer the system she maintained was a responsibility she took seriously. Yet she found herself running a hand over her close-cropped hair and adjusting her standard-issue uniform in a way she typically wouldn't bother with. Kale arrived precisely at 0600, carrying a data tablet and wearing the practical coveralls of the technical division. "Good morning." He greeted her with the same direct gaze that had unsettled her the day before. "Ready to show me how things really work around here?" Over the next several hours, Elara guided him through the filtration system, explaining the modifications and workarounds that kept the water flowing to the upper levels. Kale listened intently, asking questions that revealed a genuine understanding of the technical aspects, but a refreshing lack of pretension about the practical application. So, you're telling me that the entire colony's water supply depends on adjustments that aren't even documented? He asked as they worked their way through a particularly complex section. Alara nodded, using her height advantage to reach a valve that required regular adjustment. The original system was designed for a smaller population. Rather than install a completely new system, they just keep pushing this one beyond capacity. And you make it work, Kale said, the statement carrying a note of admiration that caught her off guard. It's my job, she replied with a shrug, though something in her warmed at the acknowledgement. A job that requires skill and dedication, he insisted. Not just anyone could do this. The words were simple, but startling in their recognition of her value beyond her biological designation. People on Level 7 weren't accustomed to having their work acknowledged as anything more than the expected contribution of the genetically inferior. As they continued through the system, Alara found herself relaxing in Kale's presence. His technical questions were sharp and thoughtful, but there was an underlying respect in his manner that gradually dismantled her usual defensive posture. By midday, when they stopped for a meal break in a small maintenance alcove away from the busier areas, she was speaking more freely than she had with anyone in years. How long have you been working the filtration system? Kale asked as they sat on improvised seats of supply crates. 7 years, she answered, since my designation came through. She hadn't meant to mention her designation, the topic being one she typically avoided at all costs. The moment the words left her mouth, she tensed, waiting for the conversation to shift into uncomfortable territory. Instead, Kale simply nodded. That explains your expertise. I've only been in environmental systems for 3 years, transferred from agricultural support on Europa Station. Europa? Alara couldn't hide her surprise. That's a long way to transfer. Kale's expression shifted slightly, a shadow passing over his features. Let's just say I didn't quite fit the profile they were looking for. Sound familiar? The question hung between them, an invitation to shared understanding that Alara could accept or reject. She studied him, sensing that his story, while perhaps different in details, carried the same undercurrent of exclusion that defined her own existence. What was your designation? She asked, the directness of the question surprising even herself. Compatibility index of 2.7, he replied without hesitation. Not officially barren, but classified as suboptimal. Not worthy of a reproductive match, but not quite useless enough to be sent to the lower levels. A wry smile touched his lips. I chose to transfer rather than spend my life as a living reminder of what happens when you fall just short of acceptable. The honesty of his answer struck Alara like a physical force. In the strictly hierarchical world of the colonies, people simply didn't discuss their designations so openly, especially not the unfavorable ones. It was a subject wrapped in shame and carefully maintained social fiction. Mine was 0, she said, the words emerging before she could stop them. Complete incompatibility. They said my skeletal structure and hormonal patterns made pregnancy impossible, potentially fatal even if it could be initiated. Rather than offering pity or discomfort, Kale met her gaze directly. And did you ever question that assessment? At first, Alara admitted. But after years of watching others with similar designations face the same reality, you stop fighting it. Or you start fighting differently, Kale suggested, his voice carrying a hint of something that sounded almost like defiance. By finding value on your own terms. The conversation should have been uncomfortable, even painful, but instead, Alara felt a strange lightness, as if speaking the truth of her designation aloud to someone who didn't recoil from it had somehow diminished its power to wound her. As they returned to work, something subtle had shifted. The professional distance Alara typically maintained had been replaced by a tentative connection, a shared understanding that neither of them quite belonged in the carefully categorized world of the colony. Over the next several weeks, Kale's presence became a regular feature of Alara's work routine. What had begun as a professional consultation evolved into a collaboration as Kale integrated himself into the filtration team, often requesting Alara specifically when complex system issues arose. Their lunch breaks, initially spent in private maintenance alcoves away from curious eyes, gradually moved to more public spaces. Alara found herself caring less about the stares their pairing inevitably attracted. The towering level 7 worker and the average-sized technical specialist from the middle tiers. It was during one such lunch, nearly 2 months after their first meeting, that Kale made a suggestion that caught Alara completely off guard. "There's a viewing platform on the East Dome that's usually empty during third shift," he said casually. "Best view of the Martian sunset in the whole colony. Would you like to see it sometime?" The invitation hung in the air between them, its implications clear. This wasn't about work or professional collaboration. This was something else entirely. Something Alara had long ago accepted would never be part of her life in the colony. "People would talk," she said, her voice low, despite the general noise of the dining hall around them. "People already talk," Kale replied with a shrug. "Why not give them something worth talking about?" His smile held no trace of mockery or pity, only a warmth that had become increasingly familiar over their weeks of working together. Alara found herself nodding before she had fully processed the potential consequences. "Tomorrow? After shift end?" he suggested, and again she nodded, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension coiling in her chest. The East Dome viewing platform was indeed deserted when they arrived the following evening. The transparent ceiling and walls offered an unobstructed view of the Martian landscape bathed in the reddish-gold light of the setting sun. For someone who spent most of her days in the artificial environment of the lower levels, the vastness of the sky and the stark beauty of the terrain were almost overwhelming. "Worth the risk of being seen together?" Kale asked softly, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "Yes," Alara answered simply, allowing herself to soak in the moment, both the magnificent view and the presence of someone who had chosen to share it with her. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Martian sky darkening to reveal a scatter of stars. In the dim light that remained, Alara became acutely aware of Kale beside her, not because of the contrast in their heights, but because of the subtle warmth radiating from his body, so close to hers. "I've never had anyone to share this with before," he said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the darkening landscape. "There's something about watching a sunset that feels wrong to experience alone." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep within Alara, a recognition of the shared isolation that had drawn them together despite all the barriers the colony's social structure placed between people like them. "Thank you for bringing me here," she replied, her voice catching slightly on the unfamiliar terrain of gratitude. Kale turned to face her then, and in the low light, his expression held a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Alara," he began, then paused as if gathering courage. "I know this isn't conventional. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this shouldn't happen. But I've never felt this kind of connection with anyone before." The words hung between them, an admission that crossed all the carefully maintained boundaries of colony society. Relationships outside of approved reproductive pairings weren't forbidden exactly, but they were discouraged, particularly relationships that served no biological purpose. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had long ago accepted that her designation meant a life without intimacy, without the kind of connection Kale was offering. Even among the Baron of Level 7, her extreme physical differences had kept her isolated. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Kale's hand moved tentatively toward hers on the railing, his fingers gently covering her much larger ones. "Neither do I," he confessed with a small smile. "But I'd like to try, if you would." The touch of his hand on hers sent a current of sensation up Alara's arm, a physical awareness she had suppressed for so long that its sudden reawakening left her breathless. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Kale moved closer, reaching up to touch her face with his free hand. The gesture should have emphasized their physical differences, the awkwardness of their mismatched heights, but somehow it didn't. Instead, as Kale guided her face down toward his, Alara felt for the first time that her body was exactly as it should be, not wrong or flawed, but perfectly suited for this moment, for this connection. Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration that quickly deepened as years of denied needs surfaced in both of them. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Alara found herself trembling with the force of emotions she had never allowed herself to feel. "Are you okay?" Cale asked, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. Alara nodded, unable to find words for the conflicting emotions surging through her. Joy and fear, desire and disbelief, all tangled together in a knot she couldn't begin to unravel. "We should go," she finally managed, aware that remaining in such a public space, however temporarily deserted, was a risk neither of them could afford to take. "Third shift will be ending soon." Cale nodded, but before stepping away, he leaned up to kiss her once more, a briefer touch, but one that carried a promise. "Tomorrow?" he asked simply. "Tomorrow," she agreed, as they made their way back to the lower levels, carefully maintaining a professional distance in the transport pods and corridors. Alara felt as though her body had been awakened from a long slumber. Every sensation seemed heightened, the brush of her uniform against her skin, the recycled air in her lungs, the lingering warmth where Cale's hand had touched hers. For the first time since her designation day, Alara went to sleep not with a sense of resignation about her place in the colony's hierarchy, but with a flicker of defiance, a small, secret flame that warmed her from within. Over the following weeks, Alara and Cale created a world of their own in the margins of colony life. They found secluded spots in maintenance areas, abandoned observation decks during off-peak hours, and even occasionally risked meeting in Cale's modest quarters in the middle tiers when his roommate was on shift. In these stolen moments, Alara discovered parts of herself she had never known existed. With Cale, her body became not a source of shame or difference, but a landscape of pleasure and connection. He touched her with a reverence that healed wounds she hadn't known were still open, and she learned the contours of his form with a tenderness that seemed to affect him just as deeply. "You're beautiful," he told her one night as they lay intertwined in the narrow bed of his quarters, the dim emergency lighting casting soft shadows across their skin. "Every inch of you." The words brought unexpected tears to Alara's eyes, not because she believed them, but because she knew Cale did. In his gaze, she had begun to see a reflection of herself that challenged everything the colony had taught her about her worth. It was around the third month of their relationship that Alara began to notice changes in her body. At first, they were subtle, a persistent fatigue that she attributed to the long hours and physical demands of her work, occasional waves of nausea in the mornings that she dismissed as a reaction to the increasingly bland food rations. But as the weeks progressed, other symptoms became harder to ignore. Certain smells in the filtration plant that had never bothered her before suddenly triggered intense reactions. Her breasts felt tender and seemed fuller. Her typically regular menstrual cycle, one of the few normal biological functions her body performed despite her designation, failed to appear. Still, Alara refused to acknowledge what these changes might signify. Her designation was absolute. She had been told in unequivocal terms that her body was incapable of conception. To allow herself to consider otherwise would be to invite a hope too dangerous to bear. Cale noticed the changes too. "You seem tired," he commented one evening as they sat in a rarely used maintenance tunnel, sharing the meager rations they had each saved from their meals. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just working hard," Alara deflected, avoiding his concerned gaze. End-of-cycle inspections are always exhausting. But Cale wasn't so easily deterred. With gentle persistence, he pressed her about the symptoms he had observed. The mornings when she looked pale and drawn, the time she had excused herself suddenly during their meetings, the changes in her appetite and energy. "Alara," he finally said, taking her hands in his, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about it before you dismiss it." She knew what was coming, had been avoiding the same question in her own mind for weeks. "Don't," she warned, trying to pull her hands away. "It's not possible." "But what if it is?" Cale persisted, his grip on her hands tightening. "What if everything they told you was wrong?" The possibility hung between them, simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. To even consider it felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. One step could send her plummeting into depths of disappointment she might never recover from. The scans, she began, but Cale cut her off. Scans can be wrong. Interpretations can be wrong. His eyes held hers, intense with conviction. Alara, I know people on level 4, medical technicians who have access to older equipment. Equipment that isn't connected to the central monitoring system. The implication was clear and deeply dangerous. Unauthorized medical testing was a serious infraction, one that could result in Cale losing his middle-tier status and being relegated to level 7 or worse. No, she said firmly. I won't let you risk that for what has to be a mistake. Then we'll find another way, he insisted. But we need to know. In the end, it was a smuggled diagnostic kit, the kind used for preliminary health assessments in remote outposts, that provided their answer. Cale had obtained it through channels he refused to disclose to Alara, protecting whoever had taken the risk of providing it. They used it in the privacy of a storage alcove deep in the filtration plant, a space so rarely accessed that dust had settled on the equipment stored there. Alara's hand shook as she followed the simple instructions, providing the sample required and then waiting the prescribed 3 minutes for a result she was certain would confirm what she already knew, that her body was as flawed and incompatible as she had always been told. The positive indicator appeared so quickly and definitively that for several long moments, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at the unmistakable symbol that contradicted everything Alara had been made to believe about herself. I'm pregnant, she finally whispered, the words strange and foreign on her tongue. But how? They said. They were wrong, Cale stated, his voice a mixture of awe and triumph. Or they lied. The distinction hardly mattered in that moment. What mattered was the impossible reality now confirmed. Inside Alara's supposedly incompatible body, a new life was forming, a life created with a man whose own designation had marked him as suboptimal. The joy that flooded through her was instant and overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by a cold wave of fear. In the highly controlled society of the colony, unauthorized pregnancies were not merely frowned upon. They were systematically terminated to maintain the careful balance of resources and genetic planning. No one can know, she said, gripping Cale's arm with urgent strength. If they find out, they won't, he assured her, though they both knew the promise was impossible to guarantee. Not until we figure out what to do. But as the weeks passed and Alara's condition became increasingly difficult to conceal, they both knew discovery was inevitable. Her work uniform grew tight across her midsection, and the physical demands of her job became more challenging as her body diverted energy to the growing life within. It was Dr. Lena Torres, a level 4 physician with a reputation for treating level 7 workers with unusual dignity, who finally confronted Alara during a mandatory health screening. Your biorhythms are significantly altered, Dr. Torres said quietly, her eyes flicking to the monitoring device on her wrist that was thankfully not connected to the central system during preliminary examinations. Is there something you need to tell me? The moment of truth had arrived sooner than Alara had hoped. She looked into the doctor's face, searching for some indication of whether this woman would be ally or adversary in what was to come. I'm pregnant, she admitted, her voice barely audible even in the small examination room. Dr. Torres's eyebrows rose slightly, the only visible reaction to what should have been an impossible statement. According to your designation file, that isn't possible. And yet here we are, Alara replied, a new strength in her voice as she placed a protective hand over her slightly rounded abdomen. The doctor studied her for a long moment, then set aside her scanning device and leaned forward. Who is the father? That's not relevant, Alara answered quickly, unwilling to implicate Cale. It is if the genetic compatibility was what made this possible, Dr. Torres countered. This could be scientifically significant, Alara. A pregnancy in someone with your designation. It challenges our entire understanding of reproductive compatibility. The appeal to scientific importance was clever, Alara had to admit. It offered a potential shield against the immediate threat of forced termination. If her pregnancy could be framed as a valuable anomaly worthy of study rather than a deviation to be corrected, they might have a chance. I need time, Alara said. Time to decide what to do. Dr. Torres nodded slowly. I can delay filing my report for 48 hours. Medical ethics allows me that discretion for patient consideration. But after that, I am required to log all significant health changes in the central system. Her expression softened slightly. Use the time wisely, Alara. Those 48 hours became the most intense of Alara and Kale's lives. They considered every option, from attempting to leave the colony, nearly impossible without official transfer orders, to hiding in the largely unmapped maintenance tunnels of the lowest levels, unsustainable for the duration of a pregnancy. In the end, it was Kale who proposed the most daring option, to make their case publicly, to challenge the system that had labeled them both as less than whole, to use the undeniable reality of their child as a weapon against the lies they had been told about their own bodies. It's dangerous, Alara warned, fear clutching at her heart. They could separate us, terminate the pregnancy by force, send us to the outer stations. Or they could be forced to acknowledge that their entire classification system is flawed, Kale countered. Alara, what's happening inside you now proves that everything they told you about your body was wrong. What if you're not the only one? What if there are others who have been denied the chance at parenthood based on false science? The possibility struck Alara with the force of revelation. How many others on level 7 carried the label of barren simply because they didn't conform to the colony's narrow definition of optimal biology? How many had accepted lives of isolation and diminished status because they believed what they had been told about their own bodies? We need allies, she decided. People who will stand with us when this becomes public. By the time Dr. Torres filed her report, noting the anomalous reproductive development in a designated non-viable subject, Alara and Kale had gathered a small but committed group of supporters, mostly fellow Level 7 workers who had long harbored their own doubts about the rigid classification system, but also a few middle-tier specialists like Kale who had found themselves just on the wrong side of the acceptability line. The colony administration's response was swift. Within hours of the report entering the system, Alara received a summons to appear before the Health Governance Board, the body responsible for all matters related to population control and genetic optimization. The message contained no acknowledgement of her condition, merely a terse directive to present herself for evaluation regarding biological anomalies. They're already framing it as a medical aberration, Kale observed grimly as they prepared for the hearing. Not a child. Then we make them see it as a child, Alara replied, a new determination hardening her voice. As our child. The Health Governance Board convened in a sterile chamber on Level 2, a space Alara had never had cause to enter before. The 7 members sat elevated on a dais, looking down at the single chair positioned before them, a chair clearly designed for the standard colony physique and uncomfortably small for Alara's frame. The message was clear before a single word was spoken. She did not belong in this space. She was an anomaly, an error to be corrected. Dr. Marcus Reed, the chief medical officer and head of the board, spoke first. His voice was clinically detached as he addressed not Alara directly, but the room at large. Subject 7-293 presents with an unexplained biological development contrary to established genetic designation. Initial scans indicate a pregnancy approximately 14 weeks advanced. He looked down at Alara with cool assessment. The board will determine appropriate medical intervention. The phrasing sent a chill through Alara's body. Appropriate medical intervention was bureaucratic language for termination, the correction of an unauthorized biological state. I'm not a subject, she said, her voice stronger than she had expected. My name is Alara, and I am carrying a child conceived naturally with my partner. A murmur rippled through the board members. Dr. Reed's expression tightened with disapproval. Your designated reproductive compatibility index is 0, he stated flatly. Conception should be biologically impossible given your structural and hormonal profile. Then your designation system is flawed, Alara countered, rising to her full height, a physical assertion of her presence that caused several board members to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The evidence is growing inside me right now. The doors at the back of the chamber opened, and Ilera turned to see Kale entering, followed by several others, Dr. Torres among them, along with a handful of their gathered allies. It was a breach of protocol. Hearings were meant to be closed proceedings, but the unexpected group created a moment of confusion that Kale seized upon. "Members of the board," he announced, striding forward to stand beside Ilera, "what you're witnessing isn't a medical anomaly to be corrected. It's proof that your entire classification system is built on false assumptions and arbitrary standards." Dr. Reed's face flushed with anger. "This proceeding is closed to unauthorized personnel. Security will." "Will what?" Dr. Torres interrupted, stepping forward. "Remove a Level 4 physician who is here to present relevant medical evidence. I've reviewed Ilera's original designation scans, and I've conducted new comprehensive evaluations. There is no medical reason why she cannot carry this pregnancy to term safely." The doctor moved to a data terminal at the side of the room, bypassing the security with her medical override, a bold move that could cost her position. "I'm uploading my findings now. Ilera's skeletal structure, while unusual by colony standards, provides more than adequate support for pregnancy. Her hormonal patterns, rather than being incompatible with conception as originally claimed, simply follow a different cycle than your standardized models account for." On the large display screen behind the board, medical data began to appear: comparative scans, hormone level charts, developmental projections. The technical details were beyond Ilera's understanding, but the conclusion was clear. Her body, far from being flawed, was functioning perfectly in nurturing the new life within. "This pregnancy is not just viable," Dr. Torres continued, her professional demeanor giving weight to each word. "It's thriving. And that fact fundamentally challenges the methodology we've used to determine reproductive compatibility for the entire colony." The board members exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge backed by medical evidence. It was a crack in the facade of authority, small but significant. Kale pressed the advantage. "How many others have you mislabeled? How many people have been relegated to lower status, denied the chance at family, based on flawed science? The system has maintained optimal population balance for 3 generations, Dr. Reed insisted, though his tone had lost some of its certainty. "Occasional anomalies do not invalidate." "I am not an anomaly," Ilera interrupted, her voice carrying throughout the chamber. "I'm a woman carrying a child. A woman you told could never be a mother. A woman you assigned to the lowest level because her body didn't fit your narrow definition of value." She placed her hands protectively over her growing belly. "You were wrong about me. How many others are you wrong about?" The question hung in the air, its implications rippling through the room. Several of their allies stepped forward, each sharing their own stories of questionable designations, of family members relegated to lower status based on physical differences that had never been properly evaluated. For nearly an hour, the carefully maintained fiction of scientific infallibility crumbled under the weight of lived experience and Dr. Torres's medical evidence. The board members, initially dismissive, grew increasingly uncomfortable as the pattern of misjudgment became impossible to ignore. Finally, Dr. Sophia Chun, the youngest member of the board and the only one who had remained largely silent throughout the proceedings, leaned forward to address her colleagues. "I believe we have sufficient cause to reconsider not only this specific case, but our entire approach to reproductive classification," she stated, her voice calm but resolute. "What we're seeing here suggests our models may be overly rigid, failing to account for biological diversity that remains fully functional outside our predetermined parameters." Dr. Reed began to object, but Dr. Chun continued, "As scientists, our duty is to adjust our understanding when new evidence presents itself. This pregnancy is that evidence, and we would be negligent to dismiss it for the sake of maintaining our current system." The words hit their mark. The board members, whatever their personal feelings about the challenge to their authority, were first and foremost scientists. To deny clear evidence would undermine the very foundation of their professional identity. After a tense deliberation, during which Alara and Cale stood firm under the scrutinizing gazes of the board, Dr. Reed finally delivered their decision. Subject, he began, then corrected himself with visible effort. Alara will be permitted to continue her pregnancy under close medical supervision. A comprehensive review of our reproductive compatibility standards will be initiated, with Dr. Torres appointed as special advisor to the process. His expression remained stern, but a hint of resignation had crept into his voice. This is not a wholesale abandonment of our population management principles, but rather a refinement in light of new data. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough to ensure their child's safety, enough to crack open the door for others who might have been wrongly classified. As they left the chamber, surrounded by their small group of supporters, Alara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since her designation day, she walked without hunching, without the constant physical apology for the space she occupied. In the months that followed, Alara's pregnancy became something of a quiet revolution within the colony. While the administration attempted to downplay its significance, treating it as a rare medical anomaly, the reality of her growing belly could not be contained to sterile reports and classified medical files. Word spread throughout the levels, carried in whispers and sidelong glances. The woman too big to reproduce was reproducing. The impossible was happening in plain sight. Dr. Torres oversaw Alara's care personally, documenting every stage of the pregnancy with meticulous attention to detail. What had begun as a challenge to the classification system became a groundbreaking medical study, one that would eventually lead to a complete overhaul of the Reproductive Compatibility Index. "Your body is handling this beautifully," the doctor told Alara during one examination about 6 months into the pregnancy. "Better than many women with supposedly optimal physiology." Alara, resting a hand on her now prominent belly, smiled. It knows what it's doing, even if no one believed it could. Life changed in practical ways as well. Alara was transferred from the physically demanding work of the filtration plant to a monitoring role that allowed her to sit for most of her shift. It was presented as a medical accommodation, but both she and Cale recognized it for what it also was, a subtle elevation in status. Cale, too, found his position shifting. His technological expertise, previously undervalued due to his suboptimal designation, was suddenly in demand as part of the team reviewing the classification algorithms. They weren't quite acceptance into the upper tiers, but they were steps toward a new kind of recognition. Their personal relationship, no longer hidden in shadows and stolen moments, blossomed in the open. They were allocated joint quarters, a rare privilege for non-reproductive pairs, in a section between the middle and lower tiers. The space was modest but private, a home where they could prepare for the arrival of their child. "Do you think it will be like me?" Alara asked one night as they lay together, Cale's hand resting on the swell of her abdomen where their child occasionally kicked with surprising strength. "I hope so," he replied without hesitation. "Strong, determined, beautiful." Alara turned to look at him, still sometimes surprised by the genuine admiration in his eyes when he looked at her. "Not too tall for the colony doorways, I hope," she said with a small smile. "Then we'll build bigger doorways," Cale answered simply, as if reshaping the world to accommodate their child was the most natural response imaginable. As her due date approached, Alara found herself at the center of an unexpected community. Women from various levels, some with their own stories of questionable designations, sought her out, initially with curiosity, but increasingly with a sense of shared purpose. Some came with small gifts for the baby, others with questions about how she had challenged the system, all with a new light of possibility in their eyes. Dr. Torres informed them that requests for reproductive reassessment had increased by 300% since the board's decision in Alara's case. "You've started something," the doctor told her. "Something long overdue." The labor began in the early hours of the morning, rousing Alara from sleep with a sensation unlike anything she had experienced before. Cale, instantly alert at her first sound of discomfort, had Dr. Torres notified within minutes. What followed was 18 hours of the most intense physical challenge Alara had ever faced. Her body, supposedly incompatible with reproduction, moved through the ancient rhythms of childbirth with primal intelligence. The pain was enormous, but so was her determination, a force as immovable as her frame had always been. Dr. Torres directed the medical team with calm efficiency, intervening only when necessary, allowing Alara's body to do what it knew how to do. And Kale remained by her side throughout, his presence an anchor when the pain threatened to sweep her away, his voice a constant reminder of why she was fighting so hard. When their daughter finally emerged into the world, her powerful cry echoing against the walls of the delivery room, Alara felt a completion she had never known was possible. The tiny being placed on her chest, with a shock of dark hair like Kale's and what already promised to be Alara's strong bone structure, was living proof of everything they had fought for. "She's perfect," Kale whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he touched their daughter's tiny hand with reverent gentleness. Alara nodded, too overwhelmed for words. Perfect not because she conformed to some predetermined standard of optimization, but because she existed exactly as she was meant to be, unique, unexpected, and entirely herself. They named her Nova, a new star, a new beginning. Word of the birth spread through the colony at remarkable speed. By the time Alara and Nova were cleared to return to their quarters 3 days later, the corridor outside was lined with people, mostly from the lower levels, but some from the middle tiers as well, standing in silent witness to what many were already calling a historic moment. As Alara walked among them, her daughter cradled against her chest, the usual whispers that had followed her throughout her life were absent. In their place was something new, a quiet respect, perhaps even a touch of awe. In the months that followed, the ripple effects of Nova's birth continued to spread through the colony's rigid social structure. The comprehensive review of the reproductive compatibility system, initially begun as a concession to quiet the controversy, revealed widespread inconsistencies and questionable classifications. Many of those marked as barren or suboptimal were found, upon more nuanced evaluation, to be perfectly capable of reproduction. Others, while facing genuine medical challenges, were determined to have been unnecessarily limited in their life options based on single-factor assessments that failed to consider the full scope of human biological diversity. Dr. Torres, elevated to head a new department focused on reproductive health equity, became an unexpected ally in reshaping colony policy. "What we're discovering," she explained during a public information session that Alara and Kale attended with baby Nova, "is that our previous models were built on flawed assumptions about what constitutes biological normality. Human physiology has always been more diverse and adaptable than our standardized metrics acknowledged." For Alara, these broader social changes, while significant, remained secondary to the profound personal transformation she had undergone. The body she had been taught to view as flawed and inadequate had created and sustained new life. The hands that had been valued only for their strength and maintenance work now cradled her daughter with consummate gentleness. The heart that had learned to expect rejection now overflowed with a love so vast it sometimes frightened her. Kale, too, had found his place, not as defined by colony designation, but as partner to Alara and father to Nova. His technical skills, combined with his first-hand experience of the classification system's failings, made him invaluable to the ongoing reforms. More importantly, his unwavering belief in Alara, from their first meeting to the birth of their daughter, had helped her reclaim her sense of wholeness. Nova grew quickly, displaying from her earliest months the robust health that made mockery of her parents' designations. By her first birthday, she was already tall for her age, with Alara's strength and Kale's curious intelligence evident in her every movement. She became a living symbol within the colony, not just of the classification system's failure, but of the potential that had nearly been suppressed by arbitrary standards. The changes in colony policy came gradually, as entrenched systems always change, in fits and starts with resistance and setbacks, but with steady progress nonetheless. The stark division between levels began to blur as reproductive status ceased to be the primary determinant of social worth. New metrics emerged, focused more on individual capability and contribution than on genetic optimization. Alara and Kale were offered the opportunity to relocate to the middle tiers, a symbolic acknowledgement of their role in initiating these changes. After much discussion, they declined, choosing instead to remain in their quarters between the levels, a physical embodiment of the bridges being built throughout the colony. "Our home is where we made it," Alara explained to Nova when she was old enough to understand such things. "Not where someone else decides we belong." On Nova's third birthday, as they celebrated with a small gathering of friends from various levels of the colony, Alara found a moment of quiet reflection. Watching her daughter playing with children who would never know the rigid stratification she had grown up with, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Kale found her there, observing from slight distance, and slipped his arm around her waist, a gesture that still sometimes surprised her with its casual intimacy. "What are you thinking?" he asked, following her gaze to their laughing daughter. "That she'll never have to hunch her shoulders," Alara replied softly. "That she'll never have to make herself smaller to fit someone else's idea of what she should be." Kale nodded, understanding the layers of meaning in her words. "She'll stand tall," he agreed. "Like her mother." Alara smiled, leaning into his embrace. "And see possibilities others miss," she added. "Like her father." They stood together, watching their impossible child, the girl whose existence had challenged an entire social order, whose birth had opened doors for countless others. Nova, true to her name, had become a new star in the colony's sky, her light illuminating paths previously shrouded in darkness. For Alara, the journey from outcast to mother had transformed more than her status in the colony. It had transformed her relationship with her own body. The frame that had once been her greatest burden had become the source of her greatest gift. The difference that had marked her for exclusion had become the strength that allowed her to fight for inclusion. She was still too tall for many of the colony's doorways. Her hands still dwarfed those of most other colonists. Her stride still covered ground that took others 2 steps. But now, when people looked at her, they saw more than her size. They saw the woman who had proven that difference wasn't deficiency, that the boundaries of possibility were far wider than anyone had imagined. As Nova ran to her, arms outstretched in complete trust that her mother would lift her high above the world, Alara knew with bone-deep certainty that her body was exactly as it was meant to be, strong enough to carry the weight of societal judgment, resilient enough to nurture new life against all odds, and large enough to contain the boundless love she felt for the child who had made her whole. She caught her daughter in a practice motion, swinging her upward as Nova squealed with delight. And in that moment, surrounded by the family and community they had built, Alara was neither too big nor too small. She was, at long last, exactly right.